Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and he is risen! It's that time of year again, and I wish to discuss Easter. Or, more accurately, the history and origins of the Easter holiday. This is, in fact, the second video that I have made discussing the historical origins of Easter. The first one was very short and didn't cover many details. It simply gave the general information. I always wanted to do a considerably longer video on Easter and its origins, where I go into greater detail, and I intend on doing so next year. But this year it will be a bit different. This year I will come between the two extremes. What I intend to present here is going to be longer than my original video, and more detailed than my original video, but not quite as thorough as I would want. I intended this video to go up on Monday, at the start of Holy Week, but it's going up on Holy Thursday, so it's very close to actual Easter. And the reason for that is because I have been very, very, very busy. Nevertheless, many people believe that Jesus was actually crucified on Thursday, and even if not, it is the day that we traditionally celebrate the Last Supper, with Black Friday or Good Friday being the day that we commemorate the actual crucifixion. Like I said, though, some believe that the crucifixion happened on a Thursday, giving the 3 days instead of the 2, but it's a holiday. We don't have to be completely accurate on what we present. Not that it matters, as it is a well-known fact that the Easter holiday was originally a pagan holiday and not a Christian one. Christians simply adopted it later on, or if you were less kind, they co-opted it or stole it from pagans. This is a well-known fact that is broadly distributed this time of year. The origins of Easter being, like Christmas, pagan originally. This is so well known, in fact, that it always surprises me this time of year when people decide to tell the true origins of Easter, because they always seem compelled to also act as if this is some sort of shocking revelation. In fact, many of them will say it that way. They will say that many think Easter is a Christian holiday, but it's not. No, it's a pagan holiday with pagan origins, and they play it up a great deal, and I think everyone has heard this by now. Everyone knows that Easter was originally a pagan holiday, that it was about the spring and fertility and the goddess Eostre, and that it was simply co-opted, and that all of the traditions that we get from Easter, like Easter eggs and bunnies, were originally fertility symbols used by pagans. We've all heard that. Which is why when I do videos like this, I am the one that surprises people, not the people who tell about the pagan holidays and the original origin of Easter. Because I tell people quite the opposite. Easter was never a pagan holiday. Neither was Christmas, the other Christian holiday that is often called a pagan one, but we aren't really going to go into Christmas because this video is about Easter. Bringing up this point, though, when I tell people that Easter was never pagan and has no pagan connections, and that even the pagan customs of the eggs being dyed and the fertility symbol rabbit or hare weren't actually pagan, I am always greeted with the same incredulity. People say that because I am a Christian, I don't want to admit that my religion grew out of paganism, which is rather daft because almost everyone who brings up Easter says that Christians adopted it after Christianity existed. The Christian religion is not really contingent upon the holidays. Likewise, if the stories are true about their pagan origins, Christianity already existed before they adopted it. They would have adopted Easter centuries later. So it's not like the Christian religion grew out of paganism if Easter is a pagan holiday, and the same, of course, is true of Christmas. So it's not really that. I could remain a completely dedicated Christian without believing that my religion has any pagan beliefs in it, even whilst acknowledging that the holiday that celebrates the resurrection of my Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ was pagan in origin. In fact, I actually used to do that. I used to, rather uncritically, accept the historical fact that Easter was pagan. I would myself tell people that Easter was pagan and had pagan origins and that all of the celebrations in it were pagan. I am quite willing to admit that. I used to in the past. So what changed me? Why am I not admitting to the well-attested fact, supported by an abundance of evidence, that Easter was a pre-Christian pagan fertility holiday dedicated to the goddess Eostre, or perhaps even Ishtar? Why is it? I mean, it's obvious. What do rabbits and eggs have to do with Jesus? It's clear that these are pagan symbols. Why did I start lying? It has nothing to do with my origins. After all, I grew up in the Churches of Christ, and I don't mean the United Church of Christ. I mean the ones that don't have pianos in their worship service. That Church of Christ. And the reason that is significant is because the Churches of Christ are famous for saying that if it's not in the Bible, they don't do it. That's why they don't have pianos. That's why they don't have musical instruments. All music in the Churches of Christ are a cappella. You sing with your voice. Or attempt to. I have heard some rather horrid singers in my day at Churches of Christ. Not to say all of them are, there are also lovely singers, but yes, I have heard some horrible singers. And I don't myself pretend to be a great singer. Nonetheless, the Churches of Christ don't celebrate holidays. They are not rabid in their rejection of them, as some churches are. The Churches of Christ do not label it a sin to celebrate the holiday of Christmas or Easter. They don't. You can do so at home privately if you so wish, provided you don't actively engage in actual idolatry or worship of other gods. And the Churches of Christ don't typically view these holidays as actual worship of other gods, as some churches do. Even whilst acknowledging they had pagan origins and they originally focused on that, in order to worship another god, you have to actually worship that other god. It isn't good enough. Really, it isn't. To simply have a holiday on the same day a pagan holiday was. If you are celebrating the birth of Christ or his death, burial, and resurrection, then it doesn't matter if the reason you're doing so is because the day fell on a pagan holiday. That isn't idolatry. But it is also not authorized in the New Testament. There is nothing in the New Testament that says you should celebrate Christmas or Easter, so we simply didn't. And if we chose not to keep them even at home, well, the same thing would be true. Nothing would matter in that regard. So I didn't really grow up with a strong emotional connection to Easter as a holiday. It really didn't have any significant emotional impact on me. I enjoyed Easter. My mother would get me Easter baskets, and we would have Easter egg hunts and all the usual things, but always at home. Never out at church, and it was never really connected deeply in my mind to that. I had heard, even as a schoolboy, that it was pagan originally. Many members of my church acknowledged its pagan origins. And I came to the same conclusion they did. You can say it's because I was brainwashed as a child if you wish, I don't care. But I accepted the general logic that it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you're celebrating it, go ahead, have fun. Some churches say it's a sin to celebrate Christmas and Easter. They believe that if you do so, because of the pagan origins of them, this means you are actively engaged in the worship of other gods. But that I've never found that very convincing as an argument, and it's not simply because I grew up being told that wasn't a convincing argument. It's just because it's silly. It's like if there was a famous holiday, if we were still a pagan culture, and there was a famous holiday to the god Koros, and Christians decided one day to say, we're not going to celebrate Koros. We get the day off of work, but we don't want to celebrate Koros, so we've decided it's the baptism of Jesus or something. It doesn't matter in the long run. With that said, my views on Easter changed sharply. And it's not because I converted to another church that took it more seriously, or because I began to have a stronger emotional connection to it, or anything like that. It's simply because I studied history. And what I found was actually very much important to me. It's one of the most important things that happened in my intellectual life, in fact. I had taken for granted that Easter had pagan origins. I had told people dutifully about the pagan origins of Easter. I had spoken very convincingly about the pagan origins of Easter, convinced that there was evidence that backed up every word I said, convinced that such evidence definitely existed. I was aware as I listened to the fact that not all of the stories quite added up with each other. There were inconsistencies. But I thought that's true of almost everything. We are, after all, dealing with the common man, and not everyone gets all their facts right. I realized that some of the claims were probably exaggerated or simply false, but the general story was the same and consistent with everyone that I had heard. Easter was a pagan holiday about fertility and spring. The rabbit and eggs were fertility symbols, and that when Christians entered into various lands, they adopted the holiday and rebranded it as the birth of Christ, but the common people kept the traditions, and that's why we have them. Pretty basic narrative. And I assumed it was backed by a mountain of evidence. Then I began studying history. Not specifically Easter, but I did start studying it, especially when I started getting my own degree in the study of religions. And what I found was a bit more complicated, because I never really came across this campaign of Christians to adopt pagan rituals or holidays. I never read about it in the Church Fathers. I never read about it in the history books. I never found any reference to it in ancillary sources. So one year, I decided to look into the origins of Easter. But I really wasn't convinced that I had to, because I wasn't convinced that it was an important topic. And it still technically isn't to me, on its own. But what really put me over was a desire to write an essay on the origins of Easter and its pagan roots. I did so in part for discussions I had with other people, but also out of curiosity, because I was really interested in knowing the true story. I had heard various contradictory versions of the history. The core was always the same. Christians ran into pagans, and to make it easier to convert pagans, or easier on pagans who had converted, they simply adopted the holidays. But the actual details eluded me. For example, many of the sites that I had run across said that it was actually a holiday dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, a Mesopotamian goddess. Others mentioned the goddess Eostre, a goddess worshipped in Celtic lands in Britain. Some said Eostre was a variant form of the name Ishtar. So which was it? And exactly when did Christians adopt the holiday? And under what circumstance? What really got me thinking about this, besides the contradictory nature of the stories, though, is that having read history, I began noticing how hostile the early church was to anything that even remotely came off as pagan. In fact, the very people who criticized Christianity for stealing pagan holidays, customs, and traditions criticized them for that as well. Many, for instance, claimed that Christians were responsible for the Dark Ages, that Greece and Rome had a wonderful and beautiful civilization built, with advancements in science and technology, and that when Christians came along, they viewed those things as pagan and decided to destroy them, and they destroyed the books and knowledge by scientists and philosophers of ancient Rome and Greece, because they were pagan, and thus the Christians viewed them as satanic and of hell. Christians who rejected knowledge and learning and science destroyed all of that beauty and reduced Europe to the Dark Ages. This is why the Dark Ages had less technology than Greece and Rome, and why it remained in squalor. For Christianity opposed science and learning for fear that it may overturn the truth, and viewing it as pagan and of Satan. The Dark Ages were created, according to this narrative, by Christians rejecting anything that was remotely connected to paganism. And yet, they same Christians who will burn philosophy books and, at least according to this narrative, science books, and even destroy technology simply because it was pagan, regardless of how useful it is, adopted whole holidays and holiday customs and traditions. On the one hand, holiday customs and traditions are objectively less useful than technology and science are, and for another, they're more meaningful theologically. It has been long known that behavior and thought walk hand in hand and influence each other. Doing things that you associate with the worship of pagan gods is more likely to reinforce a belief in the pagan gods. Meanwhile, a better way of building a wall is only going to give you a better wall. There would be no reason to get rid of technology which is theologically neutral, simply because it is pagan. But if you do, if you think pagans invented it, therefore it is evil, why would you keep other pagan inventions, like painted eggs, or a tree in your house decorated? It began not to make much sense. Christians are destroying objectively useful tools, whilst allowing actual symbolic paganism into their midst. No one has yet become a pagan based upon the ability to make taller buildings, or the ability to get running water, or the ability to heat water. No one would have become a pagan if the steam engine had come along in the Middle Ages, even if the inventor of it was a pagan. That is simply not how people think about these things. They would simply use the steam engine. But if you think that tree is a Yule tree dedicated to the god Odin, and then Christians come along and take the holiday and keep all the same customs and traditions, and the day of Yule, December 25th, comes, and you have the Yule tree sitting in there and it's decorated, you would still be thinking of Odin. Centuries later, we don't, but they would, and they wouldn't stop thinking of Odin, so why would the church keep this? No one's thinking of Odin or Zeus or Krishna when they're taking a train, and they wouldn't have when they were first invented, even if these were the gods being worshipped by the people inventing it, but they will with holiday celebrations. But other problems cropped up. The biggest one being that mountain of evidence that proved that these holidays were pagan. I looked at the sources and found none. All of the sources are secondary or later. Most of them are just quoting other sources that quoted other sources that were far more modern. There are no ancient sources discussing pagans and the goddess Eostre and her feast day. And really no myths or legends about her either. Now, there is one legend about Eostre that explains the Easter Bunny. But it is not ancient. It is often passed off as ancient, but it is not. It's about how Eostre was walking one winter through the woods and found a bird. This bird was near frozen to death, so Eostre picked up said bird and turned her into a hare or rabbit. But this hare or rabbit continued to lay eggs. This is where the Easter Bunny came from. It is a story about the goddess Eostre taking compassion upon a bird. This story is presented as ancient, but this story was invented in the 90s. You can look it up. It's from the 1990s. A woman submitted it to a magazine. And that's kind of the point. The reason I bring that story up is because not only will someone inevitably bring it up at some point, but it kind of shows a problem I was having with the pagan origins. Because all of the claims of the pagan origins of Easter that I had ever run across, to the last, were either from the 19th century or later. None were from earlier than the 19th century. And they all come from a Reconstructionist school, a school that historians have long since discredited when studying history. These are the same type of men who initially denied Jesus existed, which many in the atheist community still holds to. It's a ridiculous theory, but it's one that I'm not discussing right now. I couldn't find any record prior to that, even in antiquity, of Christians complaining or objecting about these pagans or mentioning them. You may think that's normal. Maybe the Christians just didn't want to admit what they did, but without evidence, why should we believe this? What I also found was that the evidence that is presented, even in the later resources, is rather unconvincing. Most of the evidence for Easter being originally a pagan holiday comes from two things. The first is the name Easter, which also has nothing to do with Christ. It's not Christ's Day or Resurrection Sunday, although some Christians do now call it that. It's Easter. What does that mean? Well, it was the name of a goddess, of course. And the other thing was the fact that it falls around the spring equinox. The date of Easter is in fact calculated. It is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. In the 19th century, people began romanticizing pagan cultures as nature-centric, and as having the seasons being very important to them and to pagan ideals. Pagan Reconstructionism began at this time as well, so the idea that the pagans held the spring equinox as some great important feast day really took root. So it was argued that Easter is simply a co-opting of the spring equinox celebration, which again doesn't entirely add up. Not only is Easter always on a Sunday, which you can justify by saying Jesus rose on a Sunday, so Christians would place it there regardless of when the equinox is, but think about the rest of it. Easter is actually on the first Sunday of the first full moon, after the first full moon, after the equinox. Easter doesn't fall on the equinox, nor does it fall on the Sunday closest to the equinox. It falls on a Sunday after the full moon, after the equinox, with Orthodox and Catholics arguing over whether if the full moon was on the equinox, do you start before or after? The equinox would count it after, and Easter would fall a week after it would for Catholics. And that's sort of the point. While Easter is undoubtedly connected to the equinox, it is obviously not the equinox. The equinox is simply used to set the date. Which brings us back to the name. The very pagan name, Easter, based on the goddess Eostre and possibly the goddess Ishtar. I ran into a problem with that name. And the problem is, most countries and most languages don't actually refer to the holiday as Easter, or anything sounding remotely like Easter. In fact, only one country does, and that is Germany, which calls it Ostern. Every other language in the world refers to Easter as Pascha, or as something related to Pascha, like Pascus or Pascua. They don't refer to it as Easter at all. They don't use a word that sounds like Easter. And if it doesn't sound like Easter, is it really accurate to say then that it was a holiday based upon paganism because of the name? Now, some have argued that the original name would have been Ishtar's Day, or Ishtora, or Easter, or Eostre, and that over time the other languages simply dropped the name Easter and gave it the name Pascha. Except we don't have evidence of that. The earliest references we have to the holiday go back to the early 2nd century AD, and they call it Pascha. Britain would not call it that. Britain would not call it Easter for at least 300 more years. And that's sort of the issue that I had with it. The entire premise of it being originally a pagan holiday rests upon its name being Easter, and the holiday wasn't named Easter. It was named Pascha, which is the Greek term for Passover. It's also the Latin term for Passover. If Passover sounds more Jewish to you, it should. It is a Jewish holiday. But Christianity grew out of Judaism, and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross connects directly to that, since he is presented as the sacrificial lamb who delivers us from death, like the lambs that were killed before the Exodus happened that delivered the children of Israel from death. No, finding this out made it very clear that the Christian holiday of Pascha was a continuation of the Jewish holiday of Pascha, or Passover, and that Christians simply added new meaning to it. A meaning that was nevertheless directly related to and connected to the old Passover, one that makes sense given that Christianity is an evolution from it. There simply wasn't any reason to connect it to paganism, especially since the early church was rejecting everything pagan that it could. Would it not make more sense to connect it to the actual origins of Christianity in Judaism? And given that the earliest references to the holiday came from the 2nd century AD, it doesn't seem logical to me to really look outside of that. How could Christians have developed it from a pagan holiday when they were already celebrating it? This still, of course, left me with pagan traditions and customs. And perhaps those customs did survive as folk traditions. Maybe the church did try and suppress them but failed, and they simply got accepted over time. Some people did argue that. But the holiday itself was not really pagan, and the only evidence was the name. So where did the name Easter come from? And this is where it becomes even more complicated. You see, the modern day term English is believed to actually be a cognate of older German and Dutch words like austere or austeren. It is not really understood as directly based upon an actual goddess. But if you do go by that, the first reference to it being from a goddess came from the 7th century monk, the Venerable Bede. But Bede's statement on Easter was very limited, shall we say. Bede is the only source one can look to as confirmation of the pagan origins of Easter. The problem with using the Venerable Bede is that in his book De Temporum Ratiam, or On the Reckoning of Time, he wrote, specifically in the 15th chapter, about the supposed origins of Easter in paganism. But if you actually pay attention to what Bede is saying, he never actually says the holiday is pagan. I'm going to quote it. Eostermonth has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designated that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. And there you have it. That is the totality of evidence connecting Easter to a pagan holiday. But if you actually read it, you would realize that Bede doesn't say that the Christian holiday was originally a pagan holiday. He rather describes Eostermonth as an entire month. And while he does say that festivals were held in honor of the goddess Eostre in that month, he never specifies that they were held at the time that Christians began celebrating Easter. Rather, he just says feasts were held, which could have been at any point during the month. What Bede is actually saying is that they referred to the month as Eostermonth, and Pascha fell in that month, and it is now sometimes referred to as Paschal month. But some still call it Eostermonth. In other words, he's describing the name of the month Easter falls in, and not the actual holiday. And since they used a lunar calendar, Easter would fall basically in the same month every year, even though it's a floating holiday. This is rather like how January is named after the god Janus, or how Thursday is named after the god Thor. It is noting the day of the week or the month has a pagan god as the name's origin. What it is not doing is admitting that the holidays that fall in those months are pagan. If Christians had a holiday named January Day, then even if the holiday was originally designated to celebrate the creation of the church, or the martyrdom of St. Peter, or the life of the apostles, if they called it January Day, it would not be called January Day because it was originally a pagan holiday to honor Janus. It would be called January Day because it fell in January. And that seems to be what Bede is saying here, that some called it Easter Day because it fell in Easter month, and Easter month was named after a goddess. It isn't about the celebration at all. Also absent in Bede's account are references to rabbits and eggs. That's because these weren't really customs during Bede's time. The Easter egg actually goes back to the 1200s, and seems to be more connected with the celebration of Lent rather than as part of any sort of pagan holdover. The celebration seems to have been derived from Mesopotamia, and with the Orthodox Church, who dyed eggs red, for the blood of Christ. Eggs were forbidden to be eaten in Lent, so on Easter Sunday, when the Lenten fast was broken, people would have a big feast, usually at the church with others. Hard-boiled eggs were, of course, easier to transport than real ones, and they don't want to cook them while they're there, so they became common. We don't know why, but people began dyeing them red in honor of the birth of Christ, and the practice spread from the Orthodox East to the Catholic West, and has been a mainstay ever since. While it is true that eggs have played a part in many pagan customs and cultures, and even painting or decorating eggs is not something unique to Christianity, since eggs come from nature, it makes sense that they would find their way into many cultures' particular usage, both in terms of being a food source and as decoration or for ceremonial or ritual use. There is no reason, then, to assume that Christians must have gotten this directly from pagans, and there doesn't seem to be any history behind it, considering how late the tradition is in concerning the eggs, in relation to pagan influences, that is. The Easter Bunny is actually worse, though, because the Easter Bunny goes back to the 1500s and was a specifically German and specifically German Protestant innovation that seems to have been derived from German Lutherans who did not wish to introduce their children to Lenten fasting, but did wish to keep the holiday of Easter, or Ostern since they were German, and who did wish to keep the colored eggs because they found them fun. Children were told that the rabbit delivered the eggs. But the Easter Bunny, unlike the Easter egg, is not universal in Easter. Most cultures that celebrate Easter do not involve the Easter Bunny. France does not have an Easter Bunny. Italy does not have an Easter Bunny. Holland does not have an Easter Bunny. Spain does not have an Easter Bunny. The Easter Bunny is limited to essentially cultures that were influenced by Germany, notably Great Britain and, of course, the United States. And again, there's no evidence of an Easter Bunny prior to the 1500s. Why would German Lutherans adopt a pre-Christian pagan fertility symbol? No, Easter eggs and Easter bunnies were simply not pagan. Not really. So, what we ended up with is a holiday that grew out of the Jewish Passover that assumed new meaning because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ amongst early Christian followers, who later accrued its own unique traditions, rather than being a pagan holiday with pagan customs copied and pasted directly into it. In fact, the pagan origins weren't discovered in the 19th century. They were originated in such. The idea that we should try and reconstruct the past was popular in the 19th century, and it became rather an obsession to some, especially in certain circles. And what ended up happening is that people wished to find pagan origins to everything around them, some sort of ancient meaning behind everyday folk customs. And this eventually grew to trying to find historical origins, especially in pre-Christian times, to various holiday customs. So, even though they couldn't find evidence to back up their claims, many people started imagining explanations. Jacob Grimm, for example, was a famous folklorist who tried understanding the Easter egg and created a story about why he thought it may have been added. He also developed the concept of the goddess Eostre as a fertility goddess. The truth is, the venerable bead is the only source of the goddess Eostre that we have from anything approaching antiquity. And Bede never describes her as a fertility goddess. All he says is that she had a month named after her. So the idea that she was associated with the spring, or the idea that she was a fertility goddess, is speculation from the 19th century, and from there we speculated why eggs and bunnies were associated with her. It was based upon a 19th century idea that these things must have had pagan origins, so they explained those pagan origins. But really, Easter doesn't seem to have had any real pagan connections. Worse still, though, are some people who claim other things like Easter egg rolls being pagan. They're not. They're American. They were invented by the wife of Rutherford B. Hayes in the 19th century. Or sunrise services. Many say that this goes back to pre-Christian pagan times, or the worship of the goddess, and it's an ancient celebration because the pagans believed in the power of the sun, and Christians, when they took over the pagan holiday, kept the sunrise service. Except no one did sunrise services until the 20th century. The sunrise service of Easter was invented in America by German immigrants. It is an American custom that has Germanic roots and is thoroughly modern. It simply isn't true that ancient pagans would meet on the spring equinox at sunrise to worship the goddess Eostre or any other goddess. Many of the ancient pre-Christian pagan customs, in fact, are modern, and we have obvious traceable histories, and they're not even part of the claims that people make in the 19th century, either because 19th century people knew they were new customs that had been recently invented, or because they hadn't yet been invented and they simply didn't know about them. But the mentality that everything is pagan, the mentality that Easter is pagan and everything in it is pagan, has remained. So now, any custom that we see used in the celebration of Easter must have been an ancient custom that predates Christianity. Sunrise services are done to celebrate Easter, so sunrise services must be a pre-Christian pagan custom. Why were the pre-Christian pagans doing this? Well, let's plug it in and have a reason. And it never fails to amaze me how imaginative humans can be, and how humans can take what they imagine and pretend that it is real. But there is no evidence behind it. A lot of the customs are simply too new to have been pre-Christian pagan customs. Some of them are American, so it's obvious that they're not pre-Christian pagan customs. And that's sort of the issue. People enjoy imagining Easter as pagan. Some even use it as an argument against Christianity. And some Christians even use the argument of Easter being a pagan holiday to condemn other Christians for being pagan or corrupting their faith. Meanwhile, people who are not Christian will often point to those Christians and say, "See, even other Christians have admitted it. These Christians would have no motive to admit that Christians stole the holiday. They themselves are Christian. They're just being honest. They realize they can't hide from the truth. They're being honest. Why can't you be honest, squills? Why can't you just admit that your religion has pagan DNA? Why can't you admit that the holiday you love so much is pagan? Why can't you admit that Christians stole a pagan holiday?" Well, I can't admit it because it's not true. I did admit it in the past, but can't now, because the facts led me away from it. And it is true that there are Christians who are more than willing to admit that Easter is pagan. But that doesn't make it an actual fact. Christians can both be wrong and even lie, just like anyone else can. I don't really believe most of the people who are Christian who are saying it's pagan are in fact lying. I actually, at this point, don't think most people in general who say it is a pagan holiday are lying. I do think many who are simply anti-Christian are uncritically accepting it because it tells them what they want to hear, but I've met some rather genial people who say it is a pagan holiday and who aren't meaning it as an attack. Some people are simply misled. It is a popular historical myth. It's rather like George Washington having wooden teeth. It's something everyone knows and we've all heard, but that's not really true. George Washington did not have wooden teeth, and Easter is not pagan, nor are its customs. But nonetheless, this is a common thing we hear. At any rate, I don't have much else to add, so I will be signing off now. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you've gotten something out of it. and I hope you have a happy Easter, or happy Pascha if you happen to be Orthodox. I shall sign off now, so thank you, God bless, and goodbye.